Federal troops are walking the streets of Los Angeles right now. Now, you might not like what I'm about to explain, but if we're going to resist and complain, then we got to get it right. Donald Trump called in the National Guard to police the streets of Los Angeles, where protests over ICE's immigration crackdown have erupted in different parts of the city. So we have to talk about what this is, what this isn't, and the power and the authority the president actually possesses to deploy force within the United States. This is no longer a drill. This is happening. UNFTR. So years ago, I was part of a reporting team that uncovered a procedural change to the U.S. Code that essentially gave the President of the United States unlimited authority to send the military into the streets. The year was 2013, and the president was Obama. It was one of the biggest stories that we broke, and as a result of our reporting, absolutely nothing changed. In fact, it's only gotten worse over time. Now, I'll explain more as we go, but our contention at the time was that this provision, this unilateral procedural update that upended 130 years of precedent rooted in post-Civil War Reconstruction legislation, put a tremendous amount of faith in the office of the president. Now, at the time, it was generally believed that Barack Obama was measured and steady, which we can debate and practice. But the real question was, even if we take that to be the case, what happens if we elect a madman to the highest office in the land, and he's given direct access and authority to deploy the military on the streets of U.S. cities? So we spoke to congresspeople, the spokesperson for the Pentagon, and others who basically said, never going to happen. Now, it's complicated, but here's the answer that you're not going to love. In almost any scenario that you can imagine, Donald Trump can send troops into the streets of any city, any town, anywhere in the United States without congressional authorization or an appeal to the courts. But Trump didn't manifest these rules on his own. They were handed to him by two prior administrations, both Democratic. So let's cover some definitions and legal frameworks and put them into context before we dig into a timeline that illustrates the steady erosion of our civil liberties over the past 3 decades, leading to the effective end of posse comitatus. Actually, that's a good place to start because I see a lot of journalists and pundits that are reflexively saying that this is the end of posse comitatus. Posse comitatus ended under Obama, but it was Bill Clinton who loosened the cap, which will make more sense in a moment, but let's talk about what it is and why it existed as the law of the land for so long. There are 3 main concepts that we should understand before we clarify what's happening on the ground in LA right now: posse comitatus, martial law, and military mobilization outside of the National Guard. Underlying all legality in this case is the Insurrection Act, which has itself come under scrutiny because reports from the White House have emerged that Trump is evaluating whether he can use it as a pretense for stopping the flow of immigrants into the United States. Now, that's an important story, but it only serves as a backdrop for today. It's the notion of posse comitatus that is the focus of what's happening in LA. The Insurrection Act has been used about 30 times in American history, largely to quell civil unrest, and it was last invoked in 1992 when President George H.W. Bush sent Army and Marine troops to Los Angeles to help quell the violence following the acquittal of the police officers who beat Rodney King. It has never been used for immigration enforcement. That said, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 was signed into law by President Rutherford B. Hayes to prohibit the use of the Army, the Navy, and the Marines, and then eventually the Air Force and Space Force, to execute domestic laws unless expressly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress. Now, importantly, the law does not apply to the Coast Guard or the National Guard when operating under state authority. The reason posse comitatus is usually mentioned in conjunction with the Insurrection Act is that the Insurrection Act is an explicit exception to posse comitatus, which gives the president the authority to call on the military during an emergency or curb unrest or rebellion within the United States. I'll come back to this in a moment, but the key takeaway here is that the U.S. military is not supposed to be considered part of the president's arsenal to manage domestic disturbances and certainly not without congressional consent. So let's talk about the National Guard and who actually has the authority to deploy it. Now, typically, the governor of a state is the one who calls up the Guard and deploys it. Now, in certain circumstances, a governor can coordinate with the president to federalize the Guard when a circumstance requires, in everyone's estimation, as was the case in the LA riots in '92. In today's instance, it was President Trump, not Governor Gavin Newsom, who called in and deployed the California National Guard to Los Angeles over the weekend. Trump federalized the state's National Guard over the objections of Governor Newsom, using his authority under federal law to respond to protests against immigration enforcement actions. Now, of course, Governor Newsom publicly criticized the move as, quote, purposefully inflammatory, and stated that the federal government was taking over the California Guard and deploying 2,000 soldiers in LA without its request or approval. Newsom urged Californians to remain peaceful and avoid giving the federal government a pretext for further escalation, but he did not request or authorize the Guard's deployment. This is key. This action marks a rare instance in modern U.S. history when a president has federalized a state's National Guard without the governor's consent. The last notable example being LBJ's deployment of troops in Alabama in 1965. So let's talk about what this isn't. This is not a declaration of martial law, as some people in the media are lazily calling it. The term martial law is often used loosely to describe any military presence in civilian affairs, but legally, it refers to the replacement of civilian authority with military rule, a much more extreme and rare measure. Now, Trump's deployment of the National Guard was a federalization under Title X, not a suspension of civil government or rights. It's important to get the terminology right. If we were truly under martial law, then the entirety of the Constitution would be void for an unspecified period of time, with the military in charge of national affairs and presumably the president in the capacity of commander-in-chief as an absolute monarch of sorts. That's not this. Though you should know that Trump would love nothing more, and procedurally, he may be pretty close to having it. But this introduces the concept of military mobilization, and this is where the story gets interesting and scary. On Saturday, June 10, Secretary of Defense and everyone's favorite beer-guzzling backyard barbecue dad and serial signal group chat leaker tweeted out the following message. Quote, "The violent mob assaults on ICE and federal law enforcement are designed to prevent the removal of criminal illegal aliens from our soil, a dangerous invasion facilitated by criminal cartels, aka foreign terrorist organizations, and a huge national security risk. Under President Trump, violence and destruction against federal agents and federal facilities will not be tolerated. It's common sense. The Department of Defense is mobilizing the National Guard immediately to support federal law enforcement in Los Angeles. And if violence continues, active duty Marines at Camp Pendleton will also be mobilized. They are on high alert." End quote. So there's a few things to unpack here. The first is that he's using the cover of illegal immigration as an act of terrorism, which is one of the gray areas that the Trump team is forcing the courts to evaluate. This is an incredibly fragile claim that potentially undermines even the Insurrection Act, which would provide the executive broad authority. So making the connection between the act of illegal immigration and the protests surrounding how ICE is handling deportations is a stretch to begin with. But it's his last sentence that raised eyebrows, and we should evaluate. There's using the National Guard to quell domestic disturbances, which has precedent, and then there's the idea that the Marines can get involved. No one believes at this moment that the president or Hegseth have the authority to deploy a branch of the military on U.S. soil outside of the Guard. But here's where we need to look at the timeline of DoD authorizations. The effective end of posse comitatus began in 1994 under Bill Clinton on the heels of those LA riots in '92 when Bush was in office. It was expanded, however, under Barack Obama in 2013. So I'll explain. The 1992 LA riots erupted on April 29th after a jury acquitted 4 LAPD officers charged with using excessive force in the videotaped beating of a black motorist named Rodney King. The verdict sparked outrage, especially in South Central LA, where long-standing tensions between minority communities and the police boiled over. The unrest quickly spread, leading to widespread violence, arson, and assaults across the city. Over 6 days, more than 60 people were killed, over 2,000 injured, and more than 12,000 were arrested. Property damage was estimated to be about $1 billion. So the LAPD was initially overwhelmed, prompting the governor at the time, Pete Wilson, to deploy the National Guard, and President George H.W. Bush to send in thousands of federal troops and law enforcement officers in a decidedly collaborative way. The violence did subside after several days, following curfews, a strong military presence, and public pleas for peace, including Rodney King's now famous appeal, "Can we all just get along?" Now back to how the Clinton administration changed the calculus regarding domestic disturbances of this scale in the aftermath of the riots. Instead of a new bill being crafted for Congress to consider that would have amended posse comitatus or perhaps re-examined the nature of National Guard deployments in the case of large-scale emergencies, the Clinton Department of Defense relied on a procedural change to the U.S. Code to update the law. So the first real change that widened the scope of National Guard deployments happened in a procedural update to the U.S. Code under DoD Directive 3025.12. This is an important thing to understand because it leads us to this moment in LA and to how Trump might be able to wield total discretion with U.S. military assets beyond just the Guard. When a bill becomes a law, it undergoes a codification process to integrate it into the U.S. Code. When the code is updated, it's done by the Office of the Law Revision Council, or the OLRC. Now, these changes are usually considered non-substantive because they don't alter the legal meaning of statutes. At least that's how it's supposed to work. Congressional action becomes necessary when substantive changes are involved or when titles need to be enacted into what's called positive law. Major policy changes that alter the substance of laws, such as modifying rights, obligations, or penalties, require new legislation, as do situations where procedural updates risk changing a law's intent. So hold that thought for a minute for when we get to the Obama DoD regulatory change. The bottom line of the Clinton DoD 3025.12 is that they represented the initial loosening of the cap that would later enable more dramatic expansions of presidential authority. Now, the most consequential changes occurred in 2013 under Obama, when the DoD replaced the long-standing 3025.12 with Instruction 3025.21. This seemingly bureaucratic change fundamentally altered the landscape of domestic military deployment authority. Now, the original Directive .12 maintained strict limitations on military involvement in civil disturbances. It required explicit presidential authorization for deployment except in the most dire emergencies and emphasized that intervention should only occur when local authorities were genuinely unable to maintain order. 305.21 dramatically expanded this framework under the umbrella of something called the Defense Support of Civilian Law Enforcement Agencies, or the DSCA. The new instruction broadened the scope to cover all DSCA activities, including civil disturbances, counter-drug operations, and disaster response. The 2013 changes also introduced crucial modifications to civil disturbance protocols, and this is where Hegseth, sadly, is on terra firma. The instruction created new emergency authority provisions that allowed local military commanders to act on their own and without prior approval in situations deemed to involve imminent loss of life. This provision effectively created a significant loophole in the traditional requirement for explicit presidential authorization. Now, during the required public comment period, the DoD received only 2 major comments, both of which proved to be remarkably prescient. The first commenter urged the Pentagon to clarify what constitutes civil disturbances and argued that such important changes were too significant for administrative rulemaking. They should have been presented to Congress for legislative oversight. The second commenter sought greater clarity regarding the distinction between state and federal deployments of the National Guard, highlighting the potential confusion for what would later become a reality. The Pentagon dismissed both comments with perfunctory, quote, "no action required" statements, proceeding with the changes despite these warnings. The final pieces of this transformation were put in place during the first Trump administration through updates to related directives, most notably Directive 302518, which was updated in 2018. These changes introduced immediate response authority, allowing local military commanders to act swiftly in emergencies without higher approval, a provision that essentially eliminated the traditional chain of command for requirements for domestic military deployment. The 2018 updates also formalized the concept of dual status commanders, who could simultaneously lead both federal forces and National Guard units during crises. Now, this innovation effectively solved the coordination problem that was identified by one of the 2010 public comments, but the cumulative effect of these changes has been to create a framework where presidents possess virtually unlimited authority to deploy military forces within the United States. So under current law, a president can federalize a state's National Guard over a governor's objections through multiple pathways. Title 10 of the U.S. Code allows federalization during any presidential declaration of a national emergency, while the Insurrection Act can be invoked whenever the president determines that violence or unrest prevents the enforcement of federal law. This specific deployment of California National Guard troops in LA illustrates how these authorities now function in practice. President Trump's invocation of both Title 10 and arguments about rebellion against U.S. authority allowed him to override Newsom's objections and deploy federal forces for immigration enforcement, a use that would have been unthinkable under the original Posse Comitatus framework. So what emerged from this 3-decade evolution is a system that has effectively ended a 130-year precedent of Posse Comitatus Act's protection against domestic military deployment. The combination of expanded emergency authorities, loosened command requirements, and a broad interpretation of what constitutes rebellion or insurrection has created exactly the scenario that the Act's framers sought to prevent: easy presidential access to military force for domestic purposes. The irony is that this transformation occurred not through dramatic legislative battles or constitutional crises, but through a series of seemingly routine administrative updates spread across multiple administrations. Now, civil liberties journalists such as Chris Hedges have been talking about the de facto nullification of Posse Comitatus for years, given the ultra-militarization of our domestic law enforcement agencies. I mean, our police now look like the military. So beginning under the Reagan administration, the federal government has been selling or granting military-grade equipment to local police, and even creating incentives and training for them to continue taking it off the hands of the military. That's why it's so hard to distinguish between tactical police agencies and the actual military. So Hedges and others have been asking what the hell the difference is if the police are just as heavily armed as our military. But the biggest takeaway that one needs to know is that the faith placed in presidential restraint is wholly insufficient. Trump can override Newsom all day, every day, and he's already done it. He can send troops to the border and even call up branches of the military that have been barred from intervening in domestic affairs unless otherwise specified by Congress under the most extreme circumstances. So it goes back to the original question that our team raised when we asked the Pentagon and members of Congress, what would happen if we elected a madman to run the country, given all the power that was unilaterally given to the president through a few pen strokes in the U.S. Code? We've abandoned a core principle that governed American civil-military relations for over a century. So now we have federal troops walking the streets of American cities, deployed over the objections of state authorities for purposes very far removed from traditional concepts of insurrection or rebellion. As crazy as it sounds, given all that Trump has put us through, this might prove to be the biggest test of our principles and whether there are limits to presidential power. Here endeth the lesson.
This is the story of a political pundit who looked at the world around him and just said, fuck it. Gives the middle finger to authority and says, kiss my ass. But instead of a revolution, he started a podcast. Just what the world needs. Started a podcast. Another basic white guy who started a podcast. But it's fun because he curses all through the podcast. Unfucking the